when designing propositions specifically for the Middle Eastern region, there are very clear senses of national identities. So when you look at countries like Oman, countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, there is no one-size-fits-all proposition. So one of the really interesting aspects to consider in the Middle East today is this idea of emergence and what that presents in terms of an opportunity for fintech. When I say emergence, I'm talking about how the regimes in each of these Middle Eastern countries are increasingly opening up to external influences and are increasingly seeking to diversify their economies away from a dependence on oil and gas, for example. Within this, there's also a drive to make the population themselves within these countries more independent. What we've seen in terms of some of the more well-publicized reforms, the removal of the guardianship system in Saudi Arabia, allowing women to drive. One of the female directors that exhibited this year at the Cannes Film Festival was Saudi Arabia, and actually that is quite an important watershed moment in terms of Middle Eastern culture on the international or on the global stage. There is generally a disconnection with personal finances in these Middle Eastern countries and generally a lower level of financial literacy. Saudi Arabia, for example, has 2% as an average of household income that is put aside for savings. Now, in a healthy economy, economists will tell you that should be much closer to 10%. As we've seen in other markets, financial literacy can be a key play for fintechs in particular. And actually, there's a real opportunity within that for fintechs to align their propositions, to align their mission statements to what it is that these countries themselves are trying to achieve. So making those populations more independent and at the same time diversifying their economies away from a reliance on oil and gas. Whilst most of these Middle Eastern countries are opening up now to external and increasingly westernized influences, understanding the significance of the history and the culture of these individual countries can provide a real edge when designing these digital propositions. We can use traditional values as an anchor, but bring in modernity and those more modern influences to really distinguish and differentiate the proposition. The big question is, how do you deliver or how do you achieve authenticity? And that's a real challenge. An example of where authenticity has been achieved in the Middle East is what we've called third-generation coffee shops. And the second generation of coffee shops is the chains that we're all familiar with. So, for example, Starbucks, which if you go to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, for example, you know are everywhere. They don't necessarily deliver that sense of authenticity because it's about going there, it's about the product, not actually about the experience. What we're seeing is an influx of what we're calling third-generation coffee shops, places where people go, they get coffee, but they're also invited to stay, to hang out, to chat and to build relationships. So we talk a lot at 11FS about digital riches, something that's real time, something that's intelligent, something that's contextual. Well, actually, if something is real time, if it's intelligent, if it's contextual, it's probably human. Taking the human element and putting that front and center in a market like Saudi Arabia where branches are still so important, how can you replicate that human experience and deliver services that genuinely feel human? So you need to understand all of those cultural nuances and actually fold those into the proposition that you're designing. And that's how you deliver that authenticity. In terms of fintech and financial services, where we've seen this done to good effect is with Emirates NBD's Live proposition. Live is a direct-to-consumer, retail, but really a lifestyle banking app. It embraces and it builds on that materialistic subculture that really sort of defines particularly the millennial population within Dubai. The reality is, were you to take Live out of that Dubai market and just drop it into, for example, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, it wouldn't necessarily land in the same way. So while the Middle East has generally tended to lag behind what we would consider to be more mature markets, for example, the UK, even the US, Hong Kong, what we're starting to see now is that regulation is beginning to change. From a regulatory perspective, most of the countries are now starting to embrace this idea of disruptive innovation. We have seen the regulators in markets such as Saudi Arabia really working very closely with international regulators, the FCA often being seen as the gold standard. The Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority has recently launched a regulatory sandbox, which is modeled almost exactly on the FCA sandbox in the UK. So as these appetites continue to shift and continue to expand, I expect that the rate at which fintech disruption continues in the Middle East is only going to grow and is probably going to start to ramp up really quite quickly.